Hi, welcome to another edition of This Issue. My guest this time is Regis Tremblay from Woolwich, who's with Occupy Maine TV. Hey Regis, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, glad to be here, Bruce.
Tell us about what Occupy Maine TV is.
Well, Occupy Maine TV is similar to what you're doing. It's citizen journalism, really. We started covering the Occupy movement down in Portland back in October, and sometime around Christmas, I met a couple of guys, and they expressed some interest in doing a TV show to document Occupy in Portland, and what has it started out with. So we've been 10 programs now on Portland's community access station, CTN5.
Well, tell us, before we get further into all this Occupy stuff that you're so heavily involved in, tell us a bit about yourself. You come from Maine originally?
Yeah, originally born and raised in Waterville. I went away to high school, and I wanted to be a priest. I wanted to be a social reformer, following in the footsteps of my hero, Father Jim Gower, who back in the 60s and 70s was way out there in terms of social justice issues, and I wanted to be just like him. So I went off and I studied to become a priest, became a Carmelite priest, served for 13 years, and then decided I needed to be somewhere else, and later got married, raised 3 kids. This all happened in Arizona.
You were a priest in Arizona?
Yeah,
that's where you did
I studied in Rome. I did all my theological studies in Rome, and then when I finished there, I was sent to Arizona and taught high school, was a hospital chaplain and parish priest. So then raised the family. I have 3 children. After 34 years in Arizona, we made the decision to come back to Maine. I came back with my 2 boys who finished high school at Cape Elizabeth. And then I had a job for a period of 3 years with the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. I was the Director of Public Information and Education. Produced a number of video documentaries there, and with the change of administrations, I found myself without a job. I was in an appointed position, and anybody from the previous administration appointees, some 100 of us, went down the road.
So LePage gave you the boot?
Yeah, I got my walking papers indirectly from him, but yeah. And that's the best thing that ever happened to me. I had the opportunity then to go into forced retirement, and you know, being a filmmaker, I continued doing that. I was trying to promote Roxanne Quimby's idea of a new national park up in the Maine North Woods around you know, Mount Katahdin, and I produced a short video documentary for her, and then Occupy started, and yeah. I got interested there.
Well, we'll come back to that in a moment, but you also were a coach for many years in Arizona and other places. You told me that your golf team won the state championship a couple times?
2 of them, back to back. But I was always interested in sports and played ice hockey until I was in my 50s, and I was supposed to be in an over 40 league, and guys were 20 and 30 years old just getting out of college, playing college hockey, and all I was doing was watching the back of their jerseys, and I felt, all right, my days are over.
You also had a radio show in Portland on a popular sports talk for a few years. What was that?
Yeah, yes, I did. It was, well, I started a nonprofit organization called the Center for Kids First in Sports, Health, and Education. I was advocating to make sports a healthier place for kids, and advocating for PE and intramurals in the schools, and it all connected with the obesity issue. And so when I came back to Maine, I was introduced to the general manager of WJAB, the Big Jab in Portland, which is a 24/7 sports radio television station, and said I'd like to continue doing a show that I started in Arizona. And they said, well, okay, we'll give you half an hour. And I go, oh, geez, you know, I'm used to doing a 2-hour show. So I got a half an hour for the first couple of weeks, and then they gave me an hour, and it got to be pretty popular. And then the next thing I knew, it was up to 2 hours, and was on the air there for 4 years, and would interview children, high school students, college student athletes, students, coaches, superintendents, medical people, that kind of a thing. So that was the nature of that show.
And you're wearing a hat that says Army Dad. You have a son that's in the Army in Afghanistan, right?
Yeah, yes, he is. And that's somewhat of a conflicting issue for me. I told both my children, well, I have a daughter, told all three of them during the first Gulf War that if they had reinstated the draft, I was going to take them to Canada. Well, that tells you a little bit about my feelings about war and soldiering. And while I'm proud of my son for what he's accomplished, because he's a Green Beret, but there's hardly a night that goes by that I don't lay awake at night wishing that he had chosen a different profession.
Yeah, well, you can count on that. There's a lot of people, and see, this I think is one of the biggest mythologies in the country, is that they say that people in the peace movement don't support the troops or don't really care about the troops, but they don't know that many, many, many people in the peace movement have direct family members that are involved. And in fact, people in the peace movement often become members of the peace movement because of that reality.
Yeah, and many of them have served, whether it be Vietnam or Korea or wherever. They're veterans for peace.
That's right.
Well,
yeah. Let's talk more about the Occupy movement. Why did you get involved? Here you came really in a way, let's be honest, out of a more traditional career path in history, and your activism was, youth sports and that kind of thing. How did you get into Occupy?
Well, when I first heard about it, and I don't know whether it was a TV news piece or read it in the newspaper, that it was happening in Portland, and I immediately, that resonated with me, and I said, geez, I got to go down there and see what's going on, because I'd like to document the movement from a filmmaker's point of view. And so I started going down and documenting the rallies that were in Monument Square and interviewing people. That's basically what I did initially, was interview. Who are you? Why are you here? What are you doing this for? What do you hope to accomplish?
What kind of things did you hear from people generally?
It's basically the same thing. I'm mad as hell. Got huge debt. I've been foreclosed on. The country doesn't belong to us anymore. The corporate takeover of the White House, of Congress, even the Supreme Court. And these were the things that were on people's lips. It was always that. And the other interesting thing when I started doing this, that there were far more older people that were out and who have been activists since the 60s. And some of them in their 80s were still out there. And one thing that I noticed, that there weren't a lot of young people, which to me struck me as quite different from the Vietnam War protests, and probably because there was a draft then, so it weighed heavy on everybody's minds. But so anyway, that's what got me interested. It just resonated with me, and I felt, wow, for the first time in a long time, someone is putting their finger on some of these wrongs that exist in our society.
Well, and how about your personal story? I mean, you had recently been laid off, and so in some senses you probably felt some affinity with people, right?
Well, absolutely. I'm living right now on a small Social Security check, and I was a priest for all those years, so 13 years a priest, but 25 years in the system, not paying into Social Security. So there wasn't much there. The rest of the years that I've worked, I paid in. And so I have a very small pension from Arizona, and a smaller one from the state of Maine. And I, for the first time in my life, found out what it was like to live from paycheck to paycheck, to worry about going to the doctor because Medicare is not going to cover it all, and go to a dentist once every 2 years. I don't regret any of that, but I think other people are suffering a whole lot more than that. And that's what I felt. I think, the years that I was a priest, I wanted to be someone who would be able to change things. So, during Vietnam, I was studying in Rome. So I was not marching on Washington or Selma. And I was aware of it, but I wasn't directly involved. And yet I was of that era, and all of those things resonated with me. I was against the war. I wanted to end Vietnam, and the whole ball of wax.
Why do you think so many people in the public still remain relatively silent about these concerns today, about the economic collapse, the corporate drowning of our democracy?
I've had a theory about this for a long time. I think that the American public, and it's probably true of people all over the world, are paying more attention and spending more time and more money on being entertained. Movies, television, professional sports, minor league sports. Here the country's in the worst recession we've experienced since the Great Depression, and yet you look at football stadiums and baseball stadiums, they're filled to capacity week after week. And people are listening to sports talk radio 24/7. I think we've been anesthetized by this whole corporate world of entertainment that we haven't been paying attention to what's really going on. I think television and entertainment has dumbed down the population so bad that people don't think for themselves anymore. They just believe something they hear from somebody else. And I think that's pretty much, for me, spells the end of democracy, and that's why it's happened. That's why there's been this corporate takeover of democracy, our freedoms, our rights. That's what got me really angry, and that's what I wanted to document and be able to communicate to the larger society, people who look like you and me, that there's a face to Occupy. There's a face to the people that are hurting. And so that's what drives me. I'm very, very driven at 67 years old to continue that battle to get the word out. I've always done that. I was a high school journalism teacher and photojournalism teacher, and in 40 years now, that's basically what I've tried to do, is to articulate different messages in different ways.
Well, there's maybe just a little bit of a contradiction here to what you said. You talked about entertainment and sports, distraction and everything else, but here you were on the Big Jab for 4 years, one of the top sports talk show hosts.
Yeah.
I mean, you weren't talking politics then, were you?
Well, I was talking politics in the sense of politics about children and sports, and actually I had a conversion. When I first started coaching, I was horrible. Yeah, we won, but I wasn't liked, and my dad retired and loved to play golf and moved out to Arizona, and he came up to me after a couple of weeks and he said, "Son, I don't even recognize you. I didn't raise you this way. You're angry, you're driving the kids, you're making them nervous, they can't play this way." And that look in the mirror stunned me. And I realized that this was not the way to deal with young people. It wasn't the way to deal with anybody. And so I had this real conversion, a real metanoia, a change in my life in terms of looking at sports. I became very disinterested in competitive sports. Lifelong Red Sox fan, it's like this stuff's not important to me anymore. So I started this nonprofit to advocate for a more sensible youth sports program, that we wouldn't put pressure on kids. They would learn to play for the fun of it, like I did, and that's what my father reminded me of. So yeah, I had a real change of heart. I barely watch today. Occasionally, if I don't have anything to do, that's maybe the only time the TV goes on, is to see what the Bruins are doing. I can't get it out of my system, but I don't patronize it anymore. I don't buy products, hats or team memorabilia. I think that just contributes to something that I think has gone way, way over the top.
Well, since we're doing confessions here, I have to say I'm a lifelong Baltimore Oriole fanatic, and my baseball team has had losing seasons 14 years in a row.
Yeah.
But as we speak, they're in first place in the American League East, and Boston is
in last.
In last, yeah.
And the Orioles just ripped them too, didn't they? Just take that 3-game
yeah,
series.
So
yeah.
I have to admit I suffer from this contradiction as well. I want to ask you this question. Did you hear about the Department of Homeland Security Freedom of Information Act documents that were just released that reveal that Obama unleashed the National Intelligence and Domestic Spying Network against the Occupy movement? The White House essentially ran the nationally coordinated police campaign to shut down the Occupy movement that was largely nonviolent, that was using their constitutionally protected rights to protest in public spaces against corporate Wall Street crimes and abuses. You know about that?
Yeah, and I wasn't surprised. I could not believe Bush Cheney created this massive new bureaucracy, Homeland Security, to supposedly protect us. But all they did was inject fear into all of us, strip searches just about when you're going into the airports. And it came as no surprise that Homeland Security, protecting the homeland, would lead to spying on Americans. And what we've seen since that time is a progression of the denial of our First Amendment constitutional rights to free speech, peaceable assembly, and the right to bring grievances to our government, which is what we're trying to do now. And then our government, with proof now from these FOIA papers, has been spying on us. And not only that, Homeland Security with the FBI and the CIA have infiltrated Occupy protests all across the country because they were so afraid of it.
What were they afraid of?
They were afraid of being discovered. They were afraid that what Occupy represented, our government has been co-opted. The president, Congress, even the Supreme Court, and our local legislators don't represent us anymore. They've been bought out by big money. Supreme Court's decision, Citizen United, granting personhood to corporations, is what allowed these super PACs to pour hundreds of millions of dollars, unreported, secret money, buying our elections. And this is what I think more and more Americans are becoming aware of. You talk to Americans about taking money out of politics, and you'll hardly find anybody who'll disagree. Do they want to believe that our own country has been denying us these rights? They don't. The myth of America being the land of the free and everybody has a vote is, I think, too hard for most people to abandon. It just destroys a particular mindset or a belief system that they can't come to grips with. That's what I think it's about.
Because, and when you do confront that reality, the next obvious question is, what are you going to do about it?
You're going to change, or you're going to go into denial. You're going to go into hibernation. And I think a lot of people are in denial because they just cannot accept the fact that our country is not of the people, for the people, and by the people.
So what this means, what this basically means then, is that the public who are angry over these corporate abuses that you just so well described, the big money taking over everything, endless war to benefit corporate globalization so they can extract oil, natural gas, water, minerals as resources decline around the world, that the people who oppose all of this corporate takeover, we're now the enemies.
Enemies of the state, exactly.
And that we will have to be brought onto the reservation, okay?
Yep. You got it. You got it. You know, when I hear we're America around the globe and sending our military everywhere to protect our domestic interest, our national interest and national security, it's a joke. It is exactly what you said.
So we have to begin to define the word "our." When they say protect our interest, we have to define who is our.
That's exactly right. And I think there's some things about Occupy that I'm not happy with, but I think what Occupy succeeded in doing is introducing into the national lexicon, the national conversation, some of these topics: money in politics, corporate takeover, denial of our rights, anti-war. It's all tied together. And when you talk about corporations, what I found is when people think about corporate takeover, they're thinking about Kraft and Pepsi-Cola, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, this kind of stuff. You rarely hear in that public dialogue the military-industrial complex, which is gobbling up some 60% of our budget, killing people all over the world, sending kids like my kid into harm's way to what? Promote a national policy of domination, superiority, whatever you want to, greed.
Why do you think that Occupy movement has been slow to make the connection to endless war, the military part of it?
That's a good question. And, probably get some people angry at me for saying this, but I think these massive protests that we saw in New York City and in Oakland and San Francisco, Chicago, always involved what the media portrayed as this clash between law enforcement, and my God, law enforcement in full riot gear, beating the crap out of peaceful protesters, has scared people. I think a lot of people don't want this violence. And there's a part of Wall Street, there's a educational outreach part that exists in some areas and not so much in other areas. It's trying to help Americans connect the dots. And you use that.
You said Wall Street. You meant the
Occupy movement. Yeah, Occupy Wall Street movement, or Occupy around the country. Yeah, it's this educational outreach to help most of America understand and connect these dots so they can understand what's happened. And I think the violence that they've seen and the attention that's been placed on homeless people, for example, the camp in Portland, it focused on the camp and homeless people for a long, long time, really created the wrong picture for the greater population. So I think that's kind of been one of the big problems.
Well, let's talk about that for a second. You mentioned the homeless people in Portland. I heard you say that the city of Portland was literally directing homeless people to Lincoln Park.
Oh, yeah.
And then once they arrived there and it became a problem, they then used that as sort of an excuse to close the camp down. They did the same thing in New York City. I know Mayor Bloomberg was literally releasing homeless from jail and telling them to go to Zuccotti
Park, yeah.
So is that basically true, that that's what happened in Portland?
Yeah, that's what happened in Portland. And what happened was, you know, more and more homeless people got there, and the Occupy people, who were just about Occupy, felt, you know, everybody's welcome here. But there started to be disruptions. There was a lot of alcoholism, there was drugs, there were fights. And so the police, after sending the homeless there, go camp out in Lincoln Park, because we'll get you out of the, you know, the doorways and, you know, the public places and out from under the bridges and railroad tracks, go to Lincoln Park and, you know, we can contain you there. Well, the police started getting calls constantly from people in the camp and from citizens saying, you need to come in there, you need to clean this up. And so for several months that dominated the local media, television and press, and turned a lot of people off. And it drove a lot of older, I think, activists away from the movement, because it had so much focused on what was going on in the camp. And I think it made it difficult for a lot of people then to identify with what was going on there.
So what do you think is the next step for the Occupy movement across the country?
Well, I think I'll start with what I see as something that I don't think was healthy. Occupy Wall Street came out with a solidarity statement, and basically it said, you know, if you're from any of these other groups, don't co-opt our message, don't co-opt our method. And I think that's a serious flaw. I think it may be a fatal flaw, because even here in Maine, we've found it difficult in some areas to work effectively with other groups who are and have been for many, many years advocates, activists against a certain piece of what Occupy is trying to say is part of the whole problem. And when you don't cooperate with other groups, you really lose your effectiveness. And I think if Occupy cannot somehow find a way to include or be inclusive or be included in other groups' protests and rallies, I have serious questions about its survivability, sustainability. That's my biggest worry, and it would be a real shame.
But do you think the issue, whether Occupy continues as a quote-unquote activist campaign, the issues are going to still be out there, right?
Well, what's terrific is we were both at a rally yesterday protesting the budget cuts to Health and Human Services up in Augusta. And there were only a handful of Occupy people, a small handful, or probably 150 people that were there, and very loud. And yet the chants that were being chanted and led by these other groups were Occupy type things. And I thought, that's terrific. We've co-opted these other groups. It isn't they've co-opted us, we've co-opted them. Why shouldn't we be there taking great pleasure and joy in having given these other groups this new way of speaking?
It's kind of opened it up a little bit, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think it's great. I don't see that as a problem, this purity of the movement. I don't see it as a problem personally. And as an objective, trying to be objective documentarian, I see different groups around here in the state of Maine who don't feel that way at all. They embrace all kinds of different people and groups, and I think that has to happen. And if it does, then Occupy will continue to be a growing force and influence in the national debate. I certainly hope so.
It's what I call the business model of organizing, when groups tend to become competitive and not cooperative, and that's sort of the business model. And I think we have to set aside that business model and go with the cooperative model, the communicative model, the communitarian model, where we reach out and embrace everyone as best we can in a principled way, that we offer to work with everyone. And again, that we try to connect the dots. We try to show the links between all the different issues. We have just a couple minutes left. Do you want to say a few things in closing to kind of wrap it all up?
Well, I really appreciate coming on the show. And I think from the point of view of citizen journalism, activism, the more we can work with each other and support each other and share our material, the more effective we're going to be in communicating through the internet, through social media, through community access stations like this one here in Harpswell, the one in Portland. South Portland is active as well. This is how we are going to overcome the blackout of the corporate media that really is not feeding the public and doing the public service in a democracy that mainstream media should be doing.
Do you think we're reaching significant numbers of people with our alternative media?
Yeah, it may not be just you and me, our show's reaching thousands and thousands of people, but when you put it all together, even people out on the street with their iPhones, capturing video and uploading it and live streaming, it's getting out there to millions of people. And I think is being very, very effective. I'm really excited about it. At 67 years old, I'm not losing any of my energy or my enthusiasm or focus. This has got me going again.
So you see yourself staying in this for a while?
Oh yeah. At least as a documentarian, but I really support everything about Occupy movement. I support everything that your organization is trying to do. Code Pink, all these people advocating for the poor and the homeless and the elderly. I see it as just all part of the same big ugly picture that we find in this country today.
So it sounds to me like your wish came true, that you would be like Father Jim Gower.
Yeah.
You have.
Well, in a very small way. He used to drive around the country in a Saab, an old beat-up Saab. Before Saabs were those nice, prestigious automobiles, with a pewter cup. His Roman collar on and going from city to city, just like you've been doing, protesting nuclear proliferation, and he wanted nuclear disarmament back in the 60s and 70s. I mean, my gosh, he gave up the easy life and he never knew where he was going to sleep the next night, but I never even came close to that.
Well, I think he'd be very proud of you today, and he would be excited to know that you were keeping his dream alive in your own way.
Well, and I'm really excited about having met you on outside this show level, and I really think that the more people like us can help and share and support, the more successful we're going to be in changing what's going on in this country.
Well, Regis, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And thank you. Thank you very much for watching another edition of This Issue. Until next time, good luck to you all, and please get organized.